It was a regular Tuesday when I walked into my boss's office, expecting to have a simple meeting about the upcoming project. Instead, I walked out with my world completely turned upside down. "Sarah," he said, his voice colder than usual, "after years of hard work, we've decided to let you go. You're fired." Those words echoed in my head like a bad dream. I stared at him, trying to comprehend what I had just heard. I had worked so hard for this company. I had given my all, sacrificed weekends, late nights, and family time to make sure I delivered the best results. And this was how it ended? I didn't cry, I didn't argue. Instead, I just smiled and said, "I understand completely." But inside, a storm was raging. I had no idea how much this moment was going to change my life, and the choices I made in the coming days would shape everything that came after. What seemed like a devastating loss would eventually lead to something far greater than I could have ever imagined. For as long as I could remember, my life revolved around my career. I had always been that person, ambitious, hardworking, and completely devoted to my job. I had sacrificed so much for the company, believing that success would come from hours of overtime, late nights, and skipping weekends with friends and family. I had always thought that if I just gave enough, I'd eventually be rewarded for my dedication. The company had been like family to me, and I had built my life around its success. I'd started working at the firm right out of college, eager and fresh-faced, just like most others. But as time passed, my commitment to the job grew stronger. I poured my heart and soul into every project I worked on. I spent countless hours perfecting presentations, handling clients, and ensuring every task was completed to the highest standard. I was the go-to person in the office, the one everyone relied on to get things done. I was proud of the work I did, and over the years, I climbed the ranks to a position I thought I had earned through blood, sweat, and tears. I had become a part of the company's core, and I felt invincible. But recently, I started to feel something was off. Small changes that had once been easy to ignore began to surface. My boss, Mr. Richards, had been acting distant. He didn't seem to have the same level of engagement in our meetings, and I noticed a growing sense of coldness whenever we interacted. It wasn't just him, though. Other colleagues seemed a little more aloof. Even the clients I had been working so closely with for years were starting to look elsewhere, quietly shifting their loyalty. I couldn't put my finger on what was happening, but there was a shift in the air that I couldn't ignore. Despite these subtle signs, I continued to push forward. I kept telling myself that the work I was doing would speak for itself. I believed that my efforts would eventually lead to recognition, and in the back of my mind, I knew that a promotion or bigger opportunity was just around the corner. I had worked hard for this, and surely it wouldn't be long before everything I'd given to the company would come back to me in the form of rewards, recognition, and respect. But there was a nagging feeling that I couldn't shake. Maybe it was the late-night emails from Mr. Richards, the sudden change in how he interacted with me, or the increasingly distant tone in our conversations. Whatever it was, it lingered in the back of my mind. I couldn't help but wonder if everything I had worked for was somehow slipping away. It was in this uncertain space that I found myself on that fateful Tuesday afternoon. The email came through, asking me to meet Mr. Richards in his office. There was nothing extraordinary about the request, so I assumed it was business as usual. I had prepared myself mentally for the usual routine, even though my gut was telling me that something wasn't quite right. I brushed it off, thinking that I was just overthinking. Maybe it was just another project review or a minor update. Maybe Mr. Richards just wanted to touch base. As I walked to his office, I remember feeling a strange sense of calm. My heart wasn't racing, but there was an unfamiliar weight in my chest. I tried to dismiss it, reminding myself that I had been through worse in my career, and nothing could really surprise me now. I had faced plenty of challenges before, from tight deadlines to difficult clients, but I had always emerged victorious. This time, though, the sense of unease continued to linger. When I entered Mr. Richards' office, the atmosphere was different. He was sitting behind his desk, which in itself felt strange. He never sat behind his desk during meetings. He always preferred to sit across from me, usually with a relaxed demeanor. But today he was hunched over, almost rigid, and his expression was serious, far too serious for my liking. I took my seat, trying to ignore the growing tension in the room. For the next few moments, I could feel the weight of his words in the air before he even spoke. There was an unsettling silence between us. Then he finally looked up at me and said, "Sarah, after years of hard work, we've decided to let you go. You're fired." Those words hit me harder than anything I could have prepared for. The ground seemed to shift beneath me, but I couldn't let him see how devastated I was. Instead, I smiled, trying to keep my composure. I had spent years building my reputation as someone who could handle anything, and I wasn't about to lose that now. I didn't want to show the pain. I didn't want to let him see how much this hurt. I had always prided myself on being the strong, reliable employee, the one who could handle any challenge with grace. I had worked for years to earn my place in the company, and now in an instant it had all been taken away. But I had learned something important in those years of sacrifice. It wasn't about showing emotion. It was about holding it together, maintaining control, and navigating through difficult situations with dignity. So I said the only thing that seemed right in the moment, "I understand completely." My words were calm, measured, and professional. But inside, I was a mess. How could he just take all of this from me without any warning? I had given everything to this company. I had put in the hours, the effort, the loyalty. I had believed that hard work would always lead to success. Yet here I was, sitting in his office, being told that my career, the one I had built, was over. The shock of hearing those words, "You're fired," from Mr. Richards still lingered in my mind long after I walked out of his office. As I left the building, my thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion, anger, and disbelief. I had worked so hard, sacrificed so much for this company, and now it felt like all of it had been thrown away without any consideration. How could he do this to me after all the late nights, the extra hours, the projects I had taken on without hesitation? How could he just end it all with a single sentence? I walked back to my car in a daze, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. I wanted to scream, to cry, to rage at the injustice of it all, but I didn't. Instead, I sat in the driver's seat of my car for a long time, staring out the windshield, trying to make sense of everything. I had always believed in the idea that if you worked hard enough, you would be rewarded. I had poured my energy, my time, and my soul into this job. I had given everything, from missing family events to sacrificing my own personal happiness for the sake of this company. I had worked under the assumption that loyalty and effort would be met with loyalty in return. But now, it felt like that belief was shattered. As I sat there, I couldn't help but think about the years I had invested, the sacrifices I had made. It wasn't just about losing a job. It was the fact that I had built my entire identity around this company. My worth, in my eyes, had been tied to my success at work. The longer I thought about it, the angrier I became. But what struck me the most was how empty I felt. Not just because I had lost my job, but because I realized I had lost sight of everything else in my life in the pursuit of success. The long hours had taken a toll on my relationships with friends and family. I hadn't seen my sister in months. My friends had stopped calling because I was always too busy to make time for them. Even my personal hobbies, things I once loved, had been abandoned in favor of projects and deadlines. It wasn't just the job I had lost, it was everything that came with it. The comfort of knowing that I had a stable career, the feeling of accomplishment when I finished a project, the recognition from colleagues, all of that had defined me for so long, and now it was gone in an instant. I felt like I was floating in this limbo, no longer part of the company, but still deeply connected to the life I had left behind. I spent the rest of the day in a fog, not knowing what to do next. I couldn't go back to my apartment and face the silence. I needed something to do, something to distract me from the chaos in my mind. So I called up a friend, Maya, who had worked with me for years and always had a clear perspective on things. I needed someone to talk to, someone who wouldn't judge me for what had happened. Maya had always been the practical one, the one who could give sound advice when emotions ran high. She picked up the phone immediately. "Sarah, what happened?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. I'm fired," I said, the words feeling foreign as they left my mouth. It still didn't feel real. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then Maya's voice softened. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry, Sarah. But listen to me, this is just a setback. You've got so much to offer. You don't need to stay stuck in this. You're so much more than this job. You know that, right?" Her words were comforting, but they didn't fully hit me yet. Maya had always been the optimistic one, the one who saw the silver lining when I was stuck looking at the storm cloud. But in that moment, I just couldn't see it. The only thing I could see was the hole left in my life, and it was hard to imagine what came next. "I don't know what to do now," I said, my voice cracking slightly. "You take some time. Think about what you really want. You don't need to jump into another job right away. Take a break. Clear your head and then start thinking about what's next. You've been so focused on this career for so long that maybe it's time to figure out what you want." Her words planted a seed in my mind. Maybe this was a blessing in disguise. Maybe this was the universe's way of telling me that I had spent too much time chasing a career that wasn't fulfilling me anymore. What had I really been working toward? Yes, there was success, but at what cost? I had spent so much of my life doing things for other people, trying to prove myself, that I had neglected the most important person in my life, myself. As I drove home that evening, I started to think about Maya's words more seriously. Could it be possible that this firing wasn't the end? Could it be a turning point, a chance to reevaluate everything I had been striving for? As much as it hurt to let go of what I had worked for, there was a part of me that realized I had been living in a sort of autopilot mode. I had been going through the motions without really asking myself what I wanted or needed. The more I reflected on my life, the more I realized that my job had become a crutch. It defined me, gave me a sense of worth. But now that I didn't have that, I had to face the reality of who I was without it. And maybe, just maybe, this was the push I needed to rediscover myself and what truly made me happy. So as I sat in the quiet of my apartment later that night, I made a decision. This wasn't the end of my story. It was just the beginning of something new. I was going to take control of my life, explore new possibilities, and find what truly fulfilled me, beyond a paycheck and a job title. It was time to find out who I was without my career defining me. And no matter how uncertain it felt, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let this setback break me. I was going to rise from it stronger, and I was going to make it count. In the days that followed, I spent a lot of time reflecting on everything that had happened. I felt like I was trapped in a whirlwind of emotions, anger, sadness, confusion, and somewhere buried under it all, a flicker of something that felt like hope. Initially, I thought about finding another job, just diving back into the workforce as quickly as possible. After all, that's what I had always done. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that simply getting another job wouldn't solve the deeper issues. It wouldn't address the fact that I had been pouring myself into a career for years, losing touch with everything else in my life, and somehow losing myself along the way. I knew I had to make a change. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to happen overnight, but something inside me clicked. This was my opportunity to reset, to take back control, and to stop letting my job define me. So I decided that instead of immediately jumping into another position, I would take some time to really think about what I wanted. I had given my all to the company, but I hadn't given enough to myself. I hadn't allowed myself the space to figure out what truly mattered to me. For the first time in years, I gave myself permission to step away from the pressure. I didn't have to rush into finding the next job. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone. I had spent so much of my life chasing promotions, recognition, and the validation of others that I had forgotten what it meant to actually live for myself. So I took a deep breath and started planning. I wasn't just going to look for another job, I was going to figure out who I really was and what I truly wanted. I started by giving myself a few days to just breathe. I spent time reconnecting with old friends, people I hadn't seen in years because I was always too busy with work. I reconnected with Maya, who had always been my sounding board. We met for coffee one morning, and I poured my heart out to her. "I don't know what to do, Maya," I confessed, my voice shaking. "I've been so focused on work, on what I thought I was supposed to do, that I forgot about everything else. I don't even know who I am outside of my job." Maya listened patiently, as she always did. "Sarah, I think you've been given an opportunity," she said. "You've been given the chance to rediscover yourself. Think about it. You've been chasing success for so long, and now you have the space to figure out what success actually looks like for you. You don't have to play by anyone else's rules anymore." Her words struck a chord with me. I realized she was right. I had spent so much of my life working to meet the expectations of others, my boss, my colleagues, society. I had been so focused on climbing the ladder that I hadn't stopped to ask myself if I even wanted to be on that ladder in the first place. What if success wasn't about the titles, the office, the promotions, or the recognition? What if it was about finding balance, happiness, and fulfillment in the things I had neglected for so long? What if I was more than just my job? I spent the next few weeks in a kind of self-reflection. I gave myself the grace to feel lost, to feel uncertain, but I also gave myself the permission to explore new things. I signed up for a painting class, something I had always wanted to try but never had the time for. I began journaling again, capturing my thoughts and dreams, the things I had pushed aside for so long. I started taking long walks, thinking about what it meant to live a life that wasn't dictated by deadlines and meetings. It wasn't all smooth sailing. There were days when doubt crept in, when I thought about the bills piling up and the need to find another job. But then, I remembered why I was doing this in the first place. This wasn't just about avoiding a job. It was about finding something that truly resonated with me, something that made me feel alive. I didn't want to just fill a position. I wanted to make an impact in a way that aligned with my values. I didn't want to be defined by the work I did for someone else anymore. I wanted to create something that was mine. One evening, while reflecting on everything, I got an idea. What if I started my own consulting business? I had years of experience. I had built a network of contacts, and I had the skills to help businesses with their marketing strategies. The thought of working for myself, having the freedom to choose my clients, my projects, and my schedule, sparked something inside me. It was exciting and terrifying all at once, but the excitement outweighed the fear. I began to take small steps toward making it a reality. I reached out to some of the contacts I had worked with over the years. Some of them were interested in working with me. Others just offered their support. I created a simple website and started brainstorming what my brand would be. The more I worked on it, the more I realized that this was the freedom I had been craving. I didn't have to work in an office anymore. I could set my own terms and pursue projects that excited me. Of course, it wasn't easy. Starting a business is always challenging, and there were moments of doubt and frustration. But each step forward felt like a victory. I was building something from scratch, something that reflected who I was, not who I thought I had to be. I was creating a life on my own terms, and it felt liberating. As the weeks turned into months, my consulting business began to gain momentum. Slowly but surely, I started to build a client base and establish myself as someone who could offer value. The financial stability was still a work in progress, but emotionally, I felt more fulfilled than I had in years. I had taken control of my life, and in doing so, I had opened doors to possibilities I never thought I would see. What had once felt like the worst thing that ever happened to me was now the catalyst for the most transformative period of my life. Looking back, I realized that being fired was not a setback. It was the turning point I needed to take charge of my own destiny. I had no idea how much this moment would change my life, but I now see that it was the best thing that ever happened to me. I had been given the chance to break free from the mold I had been stuck in for so long, and I had the power to rewrite my story. As the weeks turned into months, everything that had seemed impossible in the beginning was slowly falling into place. I had spent so much of my life working toward a version of success that was never truly mine. I had followed the path that I thought would lead to fulfillment, but instead it led to burnout and disappointment. When I was fired, I thought my world had ended. I thought that all the years of dedication had been for nothing. But now, as I sat in my small home office, surrounded by the beginnings of my new business, I realized that being fired wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of something far more meaningful. I'd been terrified at first, of course. Starting a new business, especially after a major setback, seemed like an overwhelming task. I had no guaranteed paycheck, no benefits, and no safety net to fall back on. But somehow, as the days passed, the fear started to shift into excitement. The more I worked on building my consulting business, the more I realized that I was creating something that was truly my own. There were no limits now. I could shape my future however I wanted. It was scary, but it was also exhilarating. I began to see the fruits of my labor. I started getting calls from potential clients, ones who had seen my work through connections I had built during my years at the company. They were intrigued by my independent approach and wanted to work with me directly. At first, it was just small projects, freelance marketing campaigns, brand consultations, but they grew. As word spread about my services, the jobs became bigger and more complex. I was working with brands I had only dreamed of collaborating with when I was just an employee in a corporate setting. And unlike my old job, I felt respected and valued for my unique perspective. This was my work on my terms. The moment I realized just how far I had come was when I landed my first major client, a tech startup, looking for marketing strategies to increase its brand presence. They had seen some of my work from a previous project and were eager to bring me on board. I remember sitting in my apartment that night, staring at the email confirmation. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of accomplishment that was all my own. There were no office politics, no upper management to please, and no one to answer to but myself. I had done this. I had created this opportunity. I hadn't relied on anyone else's approval or validation. I had proven that I could thrive outside the confines of a corporate job, and that was the most satisfying feeling. But the most powerful change wasn't just in the business success. It was in how I started to view myself. I had spent years defining my worth by my work, by the company I worked for, by the titles I held. But now, I realized that my value was not tied to a job or a paycheck. My worth was intrinsic, and I finally understood that success was not about climbing the corporate ladder. It was about creating something meaningful, something that fulfilled me in ways I had never imagined before. I wasn't just a cog in a machine anymore. I was the engine driving my own success. I began to embrace the freedom that came with being my own boss. I could choose the projects I worked on, the clients I partnered with, and the pace I worked at. I didn't have to compromise my values or my personal life to meet someone else's expectations. I could balance work with life, something I had never been able to do before. There was no more guilt about taking a weekend off or spending an afternoon with friends. I was in control, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. Of course, there were still challenges. There were moments when I doubted myself, when I worried if I was making the right decisions or if the business would continue to grow. The financial instability was always looming in the back of my mind, especially in the early months. But each challenge became an opportunity to learn, to grow, and to prove to myself that I was capable of handling whatever came my way. There were mistakes, yes, but there were also victories. With every successful project, every satisfied client, I grew more confident in my abilities. The true turning point came when I started receiving recognition for my work. I was invited to speak at conferences, write articles for industry publications, and collaborate with other thought leaders in the marketing field. It was a far cry from the corporate world I had left behind, but it was so much more fulfilling. I had taken my skills and expertise and turned them into something that reflected who I truly was. I was building a name for myself, not just as an employee, but as a respected professional in my own right. It felt like everything had come full circle. But the biggest revelation came when I realized that I wasn't just succeeding in my career. I was finally living my life in a way that was authentic to who I was. I had been so focused on achieving external markers of success for so long that I had forgotten to ask myself what truly mattered to me. Now I was making choices that aligned with my values, not just what others expected of me. I was creating a career and a life that felt right for me. And that was the most satisfying success of all. In the end, getting fired wasn't a failure. It was a gift. It forced me to confront everything I had been avoiding, my own desires, my own goals, and the reality that I could succeed on my own terms. That day, when Mr. Richards told me I was fired, I couldn't see it at the time, but it was the push I needed to step into a future I had always dreamed of, but had been too afraid to pursue. And now, as I look back, I realized that it was the best thing that ever happened to me. I had rediscovered myself, I had built something meaningful, and I had finally created a life where I was in control. The real victory wasn't the business success. It was the confidence in knowing that I could handle anything life threw at me, because I had learned to bet on myself. Looking back, I realized that being fired wasn't just a career setback. It was a wake-up call, a lesson in disguise that I hadn't been ready to learn until I was forced to face it head-on. For so long, I had defined myself by my job, my career, and the recognition that came with it. I had built my identity around success in the workplace, but that success was fragile. The moment it was taken away, I was left with nothing but the question of who I was without it. That's when the real transformation began. In the beginning, I was consumed by anger and confusion. How could the company, the one I had given everything to, let me go so easily? I had poured my heart and soul into that job, believing that my hard work would always be rewarded. But in reality, I had been working for a recognition that was fleeting, for a company that would move on without me the moment they decided it was time. The moment I realized that, it stung. It hurt. But it also gave me clarity. I spent the first few weeks wallowing in self-pity, questioning my worth, wondering if the years I had spent building my career had been for nothing. But then something shifted. I had time on my hands. For the first time in years, I wasn't answering to anyone. No deadlines, no meetings, no constant pressure. I was free. And though I didn't know it yet, that freedom was the first step toward rebuilding not just my career, but my life. The next few months were a mixture of uncertainty and excitement. I took the time to really think about what I wanted from my life. Not just my career, but everything. I began to ask myself the questions I had ignored for so long. What did I really enjoy? What made me happy? Not just professionally, but personally. I realized that I had been so focused on climbing the corporate ladder that I had forgotten to nurture the parts of me that made me feel fulfilled outside of work. I had neglected my passions, my relationships, and my sense of well-being. I started reconnecting with people I had lost touch with. I called up old friends, scheduled lunch dates with family, and even started taking walks outside, something I hadn't done in years because I was always too busy. I started doing things for myself. I signed up for a painting class, something I had always wanted to do, but never made time for. I picked up books I hadn't read in years. I allowed myself to rediscover the things that had once brought me joy, and in doing so, I began to rediscover myself. But the biggest lesson came when I realized that my identity didn't have to be tied to a job or a title. I was more than just my career. I had value, not because of the work I did for a company, but because of who I was as a person. The more I let go of the need for external validation, the more I began to feel comfortable in my own skin. I didn't need anyone else's approval to feel worthy. I realized that my worth came from within, from the fact that I was capable of handling challenges, of pushing through adversity, and of building something for myself. I also realized that the very thing that had felt like a betrayal, the firing, was actually the best thing that ever happened to me. It pushed me out of my comfort zone, forced me to take risks, and ultimately led me to a place where I was living life on my own terms. I had been so scared of leaving the corporate world, so terrified of stepping out into the unknown. But once I did, once I embraced the uncertainty, I realized how freeing it could be. I didn't have to answer to anyone anymore. I could create my own opportunities, make my own decisions, and pursue the things that mattered most to me. As my consulting business began to grow, I started to feel a sense of pride and accomplishment that I hadn't felt in years. This was my work, on my terms. I had built it from scratch, and I had done it without relying on anyone else's expectations or approval. I was creating something that reflected who I truly was, and that was the most rewarding feeling I had ever experienced. But even more than the business success, I felt a sense of peace. I was no longer living my life on autopilot. I had taken control, and I was no longer letting fear dictate my decisions. The fear of failure, the fear of not measuring up, had been replaced with a quiet confidence that I could handle whatever came my way. I had learned to trust myself, to rely on my own strengths, and to believe that I was capable of creating the life I wanted. When I look at where I am now, it's hard to believe how far I've come. What started as a painful, traumatic event, the loss of my job, has transformed into one of the best things that ever happened to me. I wouldn't have chosen to be fired, but I am grateful for what it taught me. It pushed me to let go of the things that no longer served me and to embrace a new path, one that allowed me to grow, to find balance, and to live a life that was authentic to who I truly am. And I realized that the most important thing I learned through it all was this: I am not defined by my job, my career, or my title. I am defined by my choices, my values, and my ability to adapt to the challenges life throws at me. I am capable of far more than I ever thought possible. The lesson was clear. Sometimes, life's biggest setbacks are just the opportunities we need to grow, change, and build something even better. So I move forward now, more confident, more centered, and more determined than ever. I know that I am the one who controls my future, and no setback, no matter how painful, can ever take away my ability to create the life I want. The journey isn't over, it's just beginning. And this time, I'm ready for whatever comes next.